Thank you all for joining us to take us down a little bit, it's hard to say deeper, but broader and into other corners on the area of social isolation. And I just want to pay tribute to my colleague, Kate Julian, at the end, who has the cover of this story, The Sex Recession. That's not really what we're going to be discussing, but maybe parts of it. But it's a great piece, and I think we've made available these magazines for you out there. So, Kate, thank you. But let me start with you, Kate, for a moment, because much of what you're talking about, which I was trying to get in with Dr. Murthy, is what are the macro forces today that are changing the way we interact? You dealt with a lot with physical intimacy, but intimacy broadly, the connectivity between people. And you wrote, printed out in small type, a 23-page article was probably, 16,000 words?
12,000.
Okay. What did your research show you?
So I started with physical intimacy in part because that's the most sort of surprising part of this picture. We all have this idea that other people are having a lot more sex than they actually are, and the young people in particular are having a lot more sex than they actually are. It's very attention-getting when you tell people, in fact, people who are now in their 20s are less likely to be physically intimate with another person and are having sex less frequently than people who were in their 20s from the Gen X during the Gen X generation or among boomers. And what I found is the sort of leading likely causes of this change are both positive and negative, which is to say people seem to be sort of feeling more comfortable saying no to sex that they don't want to have. That's a good thing. But other parts of this, sort of increasing reliance on various forms of digital entertainment, porn is one of them, but by no means the only one, increasing reliance on dating apps, rising rates of depression and anxiety, and sort of different approach to adolescence, which leaves more people coming into their 20s with less relationship experience than previous generations had, are also part of this picture. And those together are more concerning because they sort of have profound implications for our ability to connect with people, not just sexually, but emotionally.
But did you find cases, in a broad personal case, I had a fantastic mom, but my fantastic mom was a case in point for someone who completely cut herself off from nearly everyone, became highly isolated. And when she passed, I heard from a friend of hers. My mom apparently became one of the best elderly gamers in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and young kids adored her in the sense that they knew when she had problems with her. So she gamed, and so she had virtual relationships. And so a woman in Georgia, literally whom she had never met, became her best friend. So I'm just asking you, should we be cautious of the notion that digital relationships are fake relationships? Because that's some of what the implication of what is being written about more and more is that virtual world of connectivity is a fake one that doesn't fit. But I have to tell you, I found something different, at least in my mother's case, and just wondering what you found.
Well, I think in some cases, absolutely, digital connections are helping to compensate in really helpful and healthy ways for other types of connections that may be missing. And so if you can connect with somebody in another state, who you may never contact in real life and share some real connection with them, that's absolutely sort of a salutary thing. The problem that I found in my sort of dozens and dozens of interviews with 20-somethings about their relationships and lack thereof is that most of the people who were not in relationships and who reported having difficulty making relationship contacts weren't happy about it. They weren't saying, I don't want to have a relationship because I'm, spending all my time gaming or because I'm spending all my time watching streaming TV. They were saying, I'm finding it very difficult to connect with other people, and so I do these other things which make my life more pleasant in the short term, but make it more complicated to find somebody in the medium term.
Lisa, you see this out there?
Certainly.
I see you nodding so much. So do you find in the research that AARP has done that you've got, what aspect of that do you see as moving the needle in terms of how things have changed in terms of relationships?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Certainly we do. And the article was fascinating. And I would agree with you, Kate, that it really is about, and your mother's case is a case in point, it's about the quality of the connection. So we think about loneliness, right, which is subjective, how we view our own state or situation, and social connection or social isolation, which is objective. And it's not just about having contacts and the frequency of contacts, but it's about the quality of those relationships and contexts. So, for example, in our recent survey, knowing your neighbors, which Dr. Murthy talked about so poignantly in the opening session, is powerful. For older adults, 61% are lonely if they do not know their neighbors.
Let me ask you a question, Kim, on the broad side of the data of what you have found at Pew, and I understand you've kind of looked not just at the loneliness question, but the broader social context. Again, I'm trying to get the context of, if we were having this discussion in the 1930s when it was a time of social stress and you wouldn't have had the same communication, how has the social pot changed from Pew's perspective in the research you've done?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the biggest changes that we've seen in our study of the changing American family, and this sort of is the logical outcome of what Kate's seeing among people in their 20s, is that people are just not getting married like they did in the past. And I think, we know that people are marrying later, but what we have found is that many people are foregoing marriage altogether, and that's obviously one of the most solid and profound connections upon which a family can be built, and that can, most likely prevent some loneliness and aging. I think among older adults, those who are married or have a partner are less likely to say that they're lonely. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, which we haven't really talked about at all tonight, which is the changing economy and the changing job market and the extent to which that might be alienating people. So labor force participation among women has gone up, over the last recent decades, but among men it's been going steadily down, and particularly among men without a college education. And I think there's a high correlation between those men who are struggling to have a place in this economy, their own sense of loneliness and alienation, and also some of the problems that we see with opioids and addictions and deaths of despair.
What do you think? I just want to ask you, Linda, but how do we fix this? Because part of me is this has been around. There's this Columbia University study, and I apologize if I get part of this wrong, but it really impacted me. Columbia University looked at some of the heat waves that hit Europe, and they compared Paris and the death rate among largely elder folks in Paris to Rome. And for whatever reason, the measurable social and family networks in Rome with some of these folks were higher, and thus people were checking on them more. The provision of water was greater. There were other things. And so the death rate was significantly different between these two cities. So if I butchered that study, I apologize, but I know that was the large outline. But it showed very clearly, this was years and years and years ago, why have we been so poor at, whether it's abroad, because this is going on internationally, or here, at making a dent in this? And what are some of the things that you're doing to make a dent?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think first and foremost, again, this is a thread that's going through this wonderful AtlanticLIVE dialogue this afternoon, is that we haven't talked about the issue. There's been such stigma about social isolation and loneliness. So part of it is, as we keep repeating, just raising awareness about it. And we are this notion of people being less known. Our study indicates also another big topic for us to talk about, and that is that for older adults, for those who are low income, so 1 in 3 are already reporting that they're lonely, 1 in 2 for older adults who are low income, significantly higher risk for members of marginalized populations, such as those who would identify as LGBTQ+. So we do have to think about social structures as well, and the fact that we haven't addressed changes that need to occur in order to be totally inclusive as well. We lost touch with each other.
Kim, what do you think I know that you're not often necessarily prescribing changes, but you know the data well enough and the change, that do you have insights that if we were to make different sorts of social investments, we have folks from cities here, we're at the forefront of cities rewiring themselves and retrofitting themselves. We'll have sensors in just about everything. Do you see any optimistic element of how we could rewire some of that to help address some of these social isolation questions?
Yeah, well, you're right. We don't prescribe fixes
I'm
at
protecting
Pew, but
Pew here. They're not allowed to do fix it, but
you
still,
probably have some to prescribe.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would love to mention is that we did a big study on differences across community types last year, looking at the urban, rural, suburban divides that exist. And we found, sort of to our surprise, that there aren't differences in terms of sense of connectedness to community and knowing your neighbors across these different community types. So you can build strong community and connections with neighbors in the city, in the suburbs, and in rural areas. And that was really interesting. So people in cities aren't necessarily rushing around in all the hustle and bustle and not making those connections with their neighbors. We found, pretty standard levels of connectedness. But in the question where we asked about loneliness, we found that knowing neighbors and feeling connected were two of the biggest predictors of loneliness in the study. And there weren't big demographic differences, men and women, young and old. No, I wouldn't say rich and poor, because people who were more financially stressed were more likely to be lonely. But racial differences we didn't see in terms of predicting loneliness, but we did find those community connections were extremely important.
Kate, I want to ask you about your piece again. One of the things that comes blaring out at it's a lot of stuff I didn't realize, the number of folks that are living with their parents right now.
Yeah.
Now, and while that may be bad for their sex lives, doesn't
It may be
that
good in terms of
intergenerational connectivity, doesn't that yield other benefits that may in fact help address some of this? Because one of the things that we at least we hear about Greece and Italy and Spain is this, big family-oriented social network. Sorry, folks, that addresses some of this. And I'm just wondering if by economic reality, intergeneration, generations are forced back together. Does that help correct some of the alienation and mobility things, some of the things that you were laying out? And so you didn't address that in your piece, but I'm just wondering if you felt that's a net positive as opposed to a net negative.
Well, this is one of the big questions that I was left with after the piece, and I'm actually hoping to look into it for a future piece. But I think there is a lot of promise, right, and potential in a model that involves intergenerational living, for people across the age spectrums. I think certainly one thing that needs to happen for that to work better is for us to sort of change our sense of what's normal and what's desirable. Because many of the younger people who I spoke to who were living with parents felt that that was somehow a sort of mark of failure on their part. And that fed into some sort of low self-image problems that were in turn leading them to be more isolated. If we can kind of redefine this as a more functional way to live, I think that would be to everyone's benefit. In the course of reporting the piece, I spent quite a bit of time hanging out in co-living communities in DC. This didn't wind up in the piece, but I thought this was a really interesting model as well. Sort of planned group living with some sort of support involved. And people sometimes refer to this as dorms for adults, but I actually wound up thinking, it's pretty attractive actually for people when they're not living in the context of a nuclear family unit to have some sort of living setup where there's some sort of programmed social activity. And I was really struck by how diverse the places in DC are. Like We Live, Oslo, Common, a bunch of these different things. And I thought, this has got some promise to offer that is sort of beyond what I would have expected.
Lisa, AARP has got a couple of things. I think you've got this initiative that you're doing, but I'm going to have you share just a couple of moments about that. But I'm also interested in the Miami Dolphins and what you're that they go out and I
They
guess
won the football game.
Well, they won
yesterday.
the football game, but I understand that you have a collaboration with the Miami Dolphins. I do not. All my team is shocked that I mentioned it because I do not. I follow sumo, not football. But they go out and they deliver services and opportunities in the South Florida community.
Yes.
And I guess one of the questions I have, and it comes back to something Vivek was sort of alluding to, is cosmetic things that just touch something versus things that become deep and meaningful. And so how do you make a Miami Dolphins day of delivery and service into something that's not transitory and ultimately shallow and ineffective? So let me put it, and how does your other initiative, the name of which is on the floor in the paper, and I apologize for that.
ConnectToEffect.org.
There we go, yes, Connect to Effect. Share with us how to make that a deep thing that moves the needle, if you will.
Sure.
And then I'm going to go to all of you.
I'll start with the Miami Dolphins, though I didn't know much, if anything, about football before coming to AARP Foundation. We began working with the Miami Dolphins because, no surprise to all of us here, there is a growing aging population in South Florida. It's highly multicultural and really income diverse.
Very politically powerful.
And, yes, and the Dolphins use their fan base as community volunteers, and they engage them multiple times throughout the year. So what we have been doing with them is to raise the issue of intergenerational connection and the importance of reaching out to vulnerable older adults with a variety of activities over time. Now, as it relates to connecttoeffect.org, this is a platform and it's a manifestation of the commitment at AARP Foundation to end senior poverty by increasing economic opportunity as well as social connection. We see both as equally important. And it's a platform for you to take an assessment of your risk, to learn about what's happening in communities. There's a lot of mutuality stories are shared as well. We share research with you. In fact, new research on the benefit of community choirs, so the power of arts, for example, in our lives. We see connection as necessary for well-being, both physical and emotional, and harder to attain for low-income older adults. So I'm even looking out at colleagues. It's things like hearing loss and low vision or vision loss, which are real predictors and also causes. And we need technology to change. It's very expensive for low-income people to get what they need in terms of hearing devices. So that technology change will matter.
I feel like I want to say, let's all get back in 2 years and see if we've lowered it by 10%
Yeah.
or 20. It'd be interesting to come back to the measures.
We need those bold goals.
Comments and questions here. My colleague Eleni and Kay are here with microphones. So thoughts, comments. Otherwise, I will call on you. Yes, right here. Hi there, and tell us who you are.
Yeah, Bill Arnone with the National Academy of Social Insurance. Some years ago, Audrey Hepburn, the actress, was asked, do you often feel lonely? And her response was, don't confuse wanting to be alone with loneliness. Is there some confusion here in the two?
It's interesting.
There is. So I'll jump in, but others can jump in, so I'm glad you said that. It is true that you can be socially connected and still be lonely. And you can be socially isolated and not feel lonely at all. So again, I think of it at a top level as loneliness is subjective and isolation is objective. And yet it's very clear that they're connected. Very clear.
Kate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say it's clear that it's become more socially acceptable to be single, right, and not to seek to be in a relationship. That's a good thing. That's a really good development, and I welcome that. What concerns me more is that many people who are not in relationships were attributing their unhappiness and their loneliness to the fact that they were not in a relationship. So if people want it and they can't find it, if it's elusive, fraught in some way that it wasn't in the past, that is of itself concerning.
Fascinating. Yes, right here.
Thomas Cujo from Baltimore, Maryland. My question is...
Thomas, just hold the mic a little closer. There you go.
Yes, my question, so there's a book out, Palaces for the People, Aaron Kleinenberg. He talks about social infrastructure in this book, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts on what type of investment in social infrastructure or policies can be done to improve loneliness or
Kim, let
social
me start with
isolation.
you.
Okay. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, which is sort of related, and we have seen in our research in recent years, and hasn't been mentioned at all, which is the role of religion and the rise of the religious nuns in our society. And I don't know if that's, contributing to this at all, but people have fewer and fewer connections to religious institutions and are attending church or temple or wherever it might be much less frequently. And that's especially true among the young. And in the Cigna survey, the young were among the most likely to say that they were lonely and feeling disconnected. So that's just another interesting thing to throw in the mix.
Lisa, reflections on social infrastructure and what kinds of investments we ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's critically important that we're thinking about investments and that we're writing the balance of inclusion in its broadest sense across social infrastructure across this nation as well. So for me, that's everything about policies that address issues of access. So when you think about it as access to quality care, that's really important in this conversation that we're having. When you think about, I know there was a question earlier about what happens in cities, so it could be local policies as well that think about inclusion of all individuals, all neighborhoods, all people. Policy that reflects that we all lose when people are lonely and are not able to share their gifts and talents with our communities. So many more issues that we could speak about later.
Yes, right here.
Hi, Janine Jacob. Question, as we think about the Me Too movement and gender dynamics, how does that play into loneliness? Are people now more afraid to interact with individuals of the opposite sex because of perhaps some of the implications that are now
This
being
is
discussed?
definitely a Kate question. It's about 9,000 of the 12,000 words.
So the sort of short answer is that the data I relied upon for this piece does not obviously yet reflect anything that's happened in the wake of Me Too. And yet this was a theme that came up in my interviews where both men and women talked about a sort of new tentativeness and hesitancy and sort of an uncertainty about how or when to make the first move. Part of the difficulty in untangling this and figuring out how much of it is Me Too and how much of it is other things is that a bunch of other things have also changed in the past 10 years, right? Online dating has become, over a very short period of time, really the acceptable way to meet people, and by some measures, the most common way that people are meeting each other. And it just doesn't work that well for all people. So, is it more awkward to strike up a conversation in real life because people expect you to do that via Tinder? Or is it more awkward to strike up a conversation with somebody you like because of Me Too? Or is it more difficult to strike up a conversation in real life because the sort of settings in which we used to do that, we're now on our phones? And the answer is probably all of those things. I talk in the piece about how I met my husband in 2002 on an elevator. And this came up in my conversations with a bunch of young women specifically, where they asked me, they saw that I was married, how did you meet your husband? And I would tell them, and it would prompt these sort of sighs of like, oh, I would love to meet somebody with, that way, and yet it's never going to happen. That seems to be perhaps also sort of a self-fulfilling belief, right? Like if we don't believe that people are going to talk to us in physical spaces, perhaps it's not going to happen.
Can I just commend you, because it was just a wonderful, wonderful treatment of the social. I mean, I love that section of your piece with regard to the Me Too tensions that are out there. I just thought it was brilliant. Let me just in closing, ask you another question on society broadly and how, awareness raising is part of it, and also taking action, which we were asked to do today. And I'd be interested in what the three of you think are the things that one could most do to, again, make some progress on isolation, loneliness, and really broadly, mental health. And I just add, just in my own, comment, I've been so impressed with the National Council of Behavioral Health and something they call mental health first aid, which is to try to make mental health first aid and training a kind of CPR, a new CPR. And they've trained over 1 million people in this front. And 1 million people out of 300 million people may not sound like a lot, but it's a start that they've had 1 million people of all different, and that's a sign of like people making an effort to engineer, because dealing with mental health is not an easy thing of others if folks are there. So I'm just in the insights the three of you have, just as we close, on what you would add that we could think about of actually proactively doing. Lisa?
So I would say, and it's been addressed today, but I think it's very, very important that we recognize that very few people talk about loneliness or social isolation with their healthcare clinicians at any level. So to educate those who are clinically trained across this broad definition of healthcare, to bring up the subject, to understand people's needs, and then to have, in essence, social prescriptions or interventions. If you screen, you have to intervene. So really attack this with the same vigor we would other chronic diseases. And then I would say on the lower touch, the conversation we're having about everyone being able to solve, be the best possible neighbor you can be. You will feel better for reaching out, and your neighbors' lives will be improved as a result.
Kim?
I think that as we see with many issues that we study in public opinion, raising awareness about an issue can really move the needle and change opinion. And I think we've been studying teens and their attitudes, and there are a lot of concerns about anxiety and depression, and teens are really feeling it. And parents of teens are extremely concerned about this. It's on everybody's radar. So I think that's a positive sign, because it's becoming more part of the dialogue. If we can have more high-profile people addressing the issue, we've seen that can be very influential in public views and discussions too. So I think it's a process, but we're moving in the right direction.
Kate?
Yeah, I would absolutely sort of second that and say that the thing I would most like to see some changes in our thinking about is adolescence specifically. And I think this has sort of important ramifications for parents, for caregiver, for care providers, for educators, for policymakers. I think for too long we've thought about adolescence as almost a holding pen. People just have to get through it, and then they get to adulthood. And a lot of research is coming out that really shows it's a pretty crucial developmental period. And if you just skip through it, if you're not having that experience developing relationships, not just romantic ones, but platonic ones as well, it gets much harder when you're in your 20s to be able to do that in sort of lasting and meaningful ways. ways. One thing I thought was really fascinating and sort of food for thought as I was working on this piece was looking at how other countries are responding to some of these same developments. And in the Netherlands, where teenagers are also having sex later and less, good thing, they're holding hands less and flirting less and kissing less, and they've studied this. And the Dutch are really concerned about this. They sort of say if people aren't getting that kind of experience connecting, how are they going to be able to do it as adults? I think we should take it just as seriously.
As Margaret Lowe comes up to share a few words with us, I want to say thank you so much. Let's a big round of applause for Kate Julian of the Atlantic, Lisa Marsh of Ryerson, right here of the AARP Foundation, and Kim Parker of the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you so much.